The storm had come out of nowhere. Rain battered the windshield of David Parker's sleek black Mercedes, the wipers working overtime as he navigated the empty stretch of highway. His hands gripped the steering wheel, eyes squinting against the downpour. The weather matched his mood, a swirl of dark, heavy thoughts clouding his mind. David had taken this impromptu trip to escape the suffocating demands of his life in New York. His empire, built brick by brick, deal by deal, had consumed him for as long as he could remember. The millions in his accounts, the skyscrapers bearing his name, none of it brought peace. Especially not today. The date haunted him every year. 25 years ago, he had lost her, Elena, the only woman who had ever mattered. She had disappeared without a trace, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions and a hollow ache in his chest. As the rain intensified, the lonely road stretched ahead, framed by overgrown trees swaying violently in the wind. He wasn't even sure where he was going, just away. Away from the city, away from the memories. Suddenly, through the sheets of rain, David spotted something ahead. A figure, standing by the side of the road, drenched, struggling with what looked like a flat tire. It was the last place anyone should be stranded in a storm like this. Instinctively, he slowed down, his headlights illuminating the scene. A young woman, soaked to the bone, was wrestling with the spare tire in the trunk of her small, beaten-down car. She looked up as his car approached, shielding her eyes from the bright lights. There was something about her, something familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. David pulled over, rolling down his window slightly to call out over the storm. "Need help?" His voice carried through the rain, low and steady. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded, clearly relieved but wary. "Yes, please. I can't seem to get the spare out." David parked and stepped out, immediately hit by the cold rain as it soaked through his expensive jacket. He walked over to the trunk and, without saying much, got to work. The spare tire was lodged awkwardly, but with a bit of force, he managed to free it. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice barely audible over the rain. She looked exhausted, her dark hair plastered to her face. "I've been out here for an hour, and no one else stopped." David shook his head, crouching to loosen the bolts on the damaged tire. "You shouldn't be out here alone. It's not safe, especially with this storm." She gave a short laugh, though it was tinged with frustration. "Tell me about it." They worked in silence after that. As he replaced the tire, David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something oddly familiar about her. She couldn't have been more than 25, maybe younger. But there was a subtle resemblance to someone he once knew, someone whose memory haunted him. When he was done, David stood and wiped the rain from his face, looking at her more closely now. "You're all set." She smiled, a brief flash of gratitude breaking through the weariness in her eyes. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would stop." David nodded, feeling an odd connection to this stranger. "Where are you headed?" "Just back into town. My place isn't far," she replied, rubbing her arms as she shivered slightly from the cold. "Get in. I'll drive you. This storm's only getting worse." The woman hesitated, glancing at him cautiously. "I don't want to trouble you. You've already done so much." "It's no trouble," David interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "Come on." Reluctantly, she agreed. She climbed into the passenger seat of his car, pulling her wet jacket tightly around herself. David started the engine, the warmth of the car offering them both a much-needed reprieve from the cold. For a while, they drove in silence, the rhythmic sound of the rain against the windows filling the space between them. David kept glancing at her, the strange sense of familiarity gnawing at him. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Julia," she replied softly, staring out at the rain. "Julia Weston." David's heart skipped a beat. Weston. That was Elena's maiden name. It was an uncommon name, one he hadn't heard since the day she disappeared. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing. Could it be? "How about you?" she asked, her voice pulling him back to the present. "I didn't even get your name." "David. David Parker," he answered, though his mind was far from the introduction. She turned to him, blinking in recognition. "Parker? The David Parker? The billionaire?" David gave a small nod, not particularly fond of the title. Yeah. Julia let out a low whistle. Wow. Didn't expect to be saved by one of the richest men in the country. David smiled slightly, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The name Weston had struck a chord in him. He had to know more. Julia, he said carefully, you said Weston? Any relation to Elena Weston? Julia's brow furrowed in confusion. Elena? That was my mother's name. David's heart stopped. Julia continued, oblivious to the storm of emotions rising in him. She died when I was young. I don't remember much about her. David felt the air leave his lungs. Elena's daughter, sitting right next to him. The woman he had loved, the woman who had vanished without a trace, had a daughter. And that daughter was now in his car, completely unaware of the past that bound them together. David's mind spun, 1,000 questions flooding in at once. How could this be? What had happened to Elena? And why had she never told him about Julia? The road blurred before him as he tried to process the impossible. He had found her daughter. David drove in silence, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. Julia Weston, Elena's daughter. He couldn't believe it. The girl sitting next to him was the daughter of the woman he had loved and lost, the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace. How did she die? David finally asked, his voice quiet, though the question felt like a hammer to his chest. Julia glanced at him, surprised by the sudden change in his tone. She got sick when I was young. Cancer. At least, that's what I was told. She never really talked about it before it was too late. I was raised by my grandmother after she passed. David gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The Elena he knew had been full of life, a woman with fire in her spirit and passion in her soul. She had always been a mystery, but she never seemed like someone who would just fade away. Cancer? It didn't seem possible. He glanced over at Julia, trying to piece together the connection. She had Elena's eyes, her dark hair, even the same graceful way of moving. The resemblance was undeniable, but the years had left him with too many unanswered questions. Your mother, did she ever talk about me? David asked, unable to stop himself from diving deeper. Julia gave him a curious look, her brow furrowing slightly. I don't think so. I mean, I was really young when she died, so I don't remember much. She didn't talk about her past much at all. My grandmother used to say that my mother left a lot behind when she moved to the city. David's heart sank further. Elena had never spoken about him? Had she kept their entire relationship a secret? He couldn't understand why she would have done that. After all, they had been in love, hadn't they? He felt a gnawing need to know more, but he didn't want to push too hard. Julia didn't seem to have all the answers he was looking for, and it wasn't fair to expect her to. Still, the fact that she had lived her entire life without knowing anything about him, or the connection he had to her mother, left him deeply unsettled. They turned onto a narrow road, lined with modest houses, their lights flickering warmly through the rain. Julia pointed ahead to a small, cozy-looking house at the end of the street. That's me, she said softly. David slowed the car and pulled up in front of the house. The rain had lessened, but the air still felt heavy with tension. Julia smiled gratefully as she unbuckled her seatbelt. Thanks for the ride, and for helping me with the tire. I really appreciate it. David hesitated, his thoughts still spinning. He didn't want to just leave her here, not after everything he had just learned. There was so much more he needed to know. But how could he explain that to her without sounding completely unhinged? Julia, he began slowly, if you ever want to know more about your mother, or if you need anything at all, you can reach out to me. I knew her. A long time ago. Julia paused, her hand on the door handle, as she looked at him with mild surprise. You knew my mom? David nodded, his gaze steady. Yes, we were close. She was very special to me. For a moment, Julia just stared at him, processing his words. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, confusion, maybe even a hint of doubt, but she didn't press him for details. I didn't know she had many friends from back then, Julia said softly. But thank you. I'll think about it. She opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle. David watched as she hurried up the short walkway and disappeared into the warmth of her home. The front door closed behind her, leaving him alone in the car, staring at the house. His heart pounded in his chest as the rain tapped gently on the roof of the car. He should have felt relief at finding some kind of connection to Elena after all these years, but instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. How had he let this happen? How had he gone so long without knowing about Julia, without finding Elena before it was too late? David sat there for a while, staring blankly through the windshield. The memories of his time with Elena resurfaced, sharp and vivid, like ghosts he had tried to bury but never could. 25 years ago, David had been a different man. He had been ambitious, full of fire and drive, eager to conquer the world. And he had met Elena in the middle of his climb. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Bold, intelligent, free-spirited. They had fallen in love quickly, intensely, but there had always been a shadow hanging over them. David's business dealings had made him powerful, but they had also made him enemies. Some were competitors in the financial world, but others were far more dangerous. He had always suspected that his enemies might have played a role in Elena's disappearance, but he had never been able to prove it. All he knew was that one day she was there, and the next, she was gone. No explanations, no goodbyes. And now, sitting in front of her daughter's house, David was beginning to realize just how much he had lost. Elena had a child. His child? He couldn't be sure, but the possibility burned in his chest like a fire that wouldn't go out. He had to know the truth. David pulled away from the house, his mind racing as he drove back toward the city. The storm outside had slowed, but inside him, the storm was only just beginning. He needed answers. He couldn't leave this unfinished. The next morning, David made a decision. He would reach out to one of the private investigators he had worked with all those years ago, Thomas Blake. If anyone could dig up the truth about Elena's disappearance and Julia's origins, it would be Blake. He picked up his phone and dialed Blake's number, his heart pounding in his chest as the call connected. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Blake." "It's David Parker," David said, cutting straight to the point. "I need you to reopen a case. It's about Elena Weston." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Blake had been one of the few people who knew just how deeply Elena's disappearance had affected David. He had worked the case tirelessly, chasing down leads, but in the end, even he had come up empty. "Elena Weston?" Blake repeated, his voice laced with surprise. "After all these years?" "I've found her daughter," David explained, his voice tight with urgency. "I need to know what happened to Elena, and if Julia is mine." Blake let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a bombshell. You think the daughter might be yours?" "I don't know," David admitted, "but I need to find out. Can you help me?" Blake was silent for a moment, and then he sighed. "All right, Parker. I'll look into it. But you know this isn't going to be easy. The trail went cold a long time ago." "I don't care," David said firmly. "I need answers. Whatever it takes." "Fine. I'll start digging. But you better be prepared for what I might find." David nodded, though Blake couldn't see it. "I'm ready." As he ended the call, David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spent decades building his empire, but this, finding out the truth about Elena and Julia, felt like the most important thing he had ever done. The answers were out there, and David was determined to find them. David Parker sat at his desk, staring at the phone long after the call with Thomas Blake ended. The familiar sense of unease had settled deep in his chest. He was on the verge of uncovering a mystery that had haunted him for years, but the fear of what he might discover lingered in his thoughts. The following days were filled with restlessness. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, hoping it was Blake with an update. But the calls that came were from his office, clients, and business partners, distractions that felt insignificant compared to what he truly cared about. He pushed through meetings, made decisions on autopilot, all while the burning question about Julia's origins simmered beneath the surface. Could she really be his daughter? The possibility consumed him. It wasn't just about finding out if Julia was his. It was about finally getting closure on Elena. David's empire had grown, his wealth had multiplied, but none of it had ever filled the emptiness left by her disappearance. On the fourth day after contacting Blake, David received the call he had been waiting for. "David," Blake's voice greeted him with its usual bluntness. "I've found something." David's heart raced. "Go on." "It's about Elena," Blake continued. "After she disappeared from your life, she went underground, changed her name, moved to a small town, and kept a low profile. That's why no one could find her." David swallowed hard, trying to process the information. Why? Why would she do that? Why would she leave without telling me? Blake paused before answering. "It wasn't just about leaving you, David. It was about protecting Julia." David's pulse quickened. "Protecting Julia? What do you mean?" "Elena was being watched," Blake explained, "by someone dangerous. She knew her connection to you could put her, and the baby, in danger. I found old surveillance reports from that time. They were from a private investigator hired by a competitor of yours, Victor Delacroix." David felt his blood run cold at the mention of the name. Victor Delacroix had been his fiercest rival, ruthless businessman who had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to destroy David. They had been at odds for years, and their rivalry had turned personal on more than one occasion. "Delacroix?" David repeated, his voice tight. "What was he after?" "Elena," Blake confirmed. "He saw her as leverage. If he could get to her, he could use her against you. Elena found out she was being followed and decided to disappear to protect herself and her child. She must have figured that staying with you would only put Julia in more danger." David clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. Victor Delacroix had taken everything from him. His chance at a life with Elena, his chance to be a father to Julia. "She did it for Julia," David whispered to himself, trying to make sense of it all. "She left to keep her safe." "Yeah," Blake said softly. "That's what it looks like. But there's something else." David's heart sank. "What is it?" "Elena wasn't sick when she disappeared. She was healthy. Her death from cancer, there's no record of it. No hospital, no treatment. It doesn't add up, David. She didn't die of natural causes." David froze. His mind reeled as he struggled to comprehend what Blake was telling him. Elena was murdered. David sat in stunned silence, Blake's words echoing in his mind. Murdered? He had never considered the possibility. He had assumed that Elena had died quietly, in some faraway place. But this? The idea that someone had taken her life was more than he could bear. "Who did it?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know for sure yet," Blake admitted, "but the timing of her death matches up with Delacroix's activities. He had her under surveillance, and she was gone not long after. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a hand in it." David's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He felt the old fury rising within him, the anger he had tried to bury for years. Victor Delacroix had destroyed his life, and now he knew just how deep the betrayal went. But what enraged him even more was that Julia, Elena's daughter, his daughter, had been left in the dark all these years, living without any knowledge of the truth. David felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to right the wrongs that had been done to Elena. He had to tell her. She deserved to know the truth about her mother, and about him. "I need to talk to Julia," David said abruptly, standing up from his desk. Blake hesitated. "Are you sure? She doesn't know anything about this. Dropping all of this on her might be a lot to take in." David's jaw tightened. "She needs to know the truth. I owe it to her, and to Elena." Blake sighed. "All right, but be careful. Delacroix is still out there, and if he finds out that you've reconnected with Julia, he might come after her again." "I'll keep her safe," David said, his voice firm. "I won't let him hurt her." As David ended the call, his mind raced with what needed to be done. He couldn't delay any longer. Julia had to know who she really was. He grabbed his keys and left his office, driving straight to her house. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within him raged stronger than ever. When David arrived at Julia's modest home, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. How would she react? Would she be angry, confused, hurt? He couldn't predict her response, but he knew that the truth had to come out. He couldn't keep it from her any longer. The door opened, and Julia stood there, looking surprised to see him again. "David? What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," David said, his voice urgent. "It's about your mother." Julia's expression softened with curiosity, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. David walked into the small living room, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. "Julia, I found out something about your mother," David began, his tone gentle but firm. "And I need to tell you the truth. About her, about what happened, and about me." Julia frowned, her arms crossing over her chest as she sat down on the worn sofa. "What do you mean? What truth?" David sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. His heart raced, but he knew he couldn't hold back now. "Elena didn't just disappear. She left because she was trying to protect you. There were people after her. Dangerous people. One of them was a man named Victor Delacroix." Julia's eyes widened in confusion and alarm. "What? Why would anyone be after my mother?" David swallowed hard. "Because of me. She was with me before you were born. We were in love. Delacroix was my enemy. He wanted to destroy me, and he was using your mother as leverage. When she found out, she ran to protect you." Julia's face turned pale as she processed his words. "You knew my mother? You were with her?" "Yes," David said quietly, his voice full of regret. "And Julia, there's more. I don't know for sure, but I think I might be your father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and overwhelming. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, disbelief and shock clear in her expression. "My father," she whispered, her voice trembling. David nodded, his eyes full of emotion. "It's possible. I don't know for certain yet, but I'm working on finding out. I'm so sorry that you had to grow up without knowing any of this, without knowing your mother's truth." Julia stood up abruptly, pacing the small living room as she tried to wrap her mind around everything he had just told her. This is too much. I don't know what to think. My whole life, I thought my mother died quietly, and now you're telling me she was running from some dangerous man and that you could be my father?" "I know it's a lot," David said, standing up as well, "but I swear to you, I didn't know about you. If I had known, I would have done everything to protect you." Julia stopped pacing and looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "Why now? Why are you telling me all of this now?" "Because I finally found you," David said, his voice breaking slightly, "and I can't let you live in the dark any longer. You deserve to know the truth. And I swear, Julia, I'll protect you. I'll make sure Delacroix never comes near you again." Julia shook her head, her emotions swirling inside her. "I need time. I need to process this." David nodded, his heart heavy. "Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." As David left her house, the weight of what he had just done pressed down on him. He had told Julia the truth, but the battle was far from over. Delacroix was still out there, and if Julia really was his daughter, the danger was only beginning. The cool night air hit David's face as he stepped out of Julia's house, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just revealed. Telling her the truth was necessary, but it didn't make it any easier. He could still see the shock in her eyes, the disbelief. She had grown up thinking her life was one thing, only to discover that it was built on secrets, danger, and a past she had no control over. David sat in his car for a few moments, staring blankly at the steering wheel. His mind was racing, blaming himself for not protecting Elena, not knowing about Julia sooner, and for the countless missed years that could never be recovered. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Thomas Blake. "Blake," David answered, his voice tense. "I've got more for you," Blake said, his voice low and serious. "It's about Delacroix." David sat up straighter. "What did you find?" "Delacroix's activities have been quiet for the last few years, but that's only on the surface. He's been working through proxies, shadow companies, and frontmen. It's hard to trace, but I've uncovered some records, enough to know he's still got his eye on you. And now that Julia's back in the picture, you can bet he's watching her too." David felt a chill run down his spine. Victor Delacroix was a man who thrived on destruction. If he knew about Julia, it meant she was in real danger. David had failed to protect Elena from him all those years ago. He wouldn't let the same happen to her daughter. His daughter. What's his next move? David asked, his voice hardening with determination. "That's the problem," Blake continued. "He's playing it slow, using the shadows. But knowing Delacroix, he's not going to stay quiet for long. He'll make his move when you least expect it. I suggest you take extra precautions around Julia. She's going to need protection. David's chest tightened. The reality of the situation was sinking in quickly. I'll handle it, he said. Thanks for the heads up. Be careful, David, Blake warned before hanging up. David sat in the silence of his car, the weight of Blake's words pressing down on him. He knew Victor's methods well, cold, calculated, and ruthless. David had fought battles in the corporate world, outmaneuvering rivals and winning every time. But this wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. Delacroix had taken Elena from him, and now, if he found out about Julia, there was no telling what he might do to her. He couldn't afford to wait and react. He had to take action now. The next morning, David called in a favor from one of the most discreet security firms in the city. He didn't want to scare Julia, but he had to make sure she was protected. Victor Delacroix was capable of anything, and he wouldn't rest until he had used Julia as leverage, just as he had planned to do with Elena years ago. Later that day, David visited Julia again. As she opened the door, she seemed calmer than the night before, though the tension still lingered in her eyes. I didn't expect to see you so soon, she said, her voice cautious. David gave her a small smile, but his eyes were filled with concern. I couldn't leave things the way they were. There's more you need to know about your safety. Julia's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. What do you mean? Victor Delacroix, the man I told you about. He's still out there, and he's dangerous. If he finds out about you, there's a chance he might come after you. Julia's eyes widened. Come after me? Why? I don't even know him. I have nothing to do with any of this. David took a deep breath. It doesn't matter to Delacroix. All he cares about is using you to get to me. He's done it before, with your mother. I need to make sure you're safe. Julia looked away, pacing for a moment as she tried to process the information. So, what? I'm supposed to hide? To live in fear because of some feud between you and this guy? I'm not asking you to hide, David said gently, stepping closer. I'm asking you to let me help. I've arranged for security to watch over you, discreetly, just for a while, until we're sure Delacroix doesn't know who you are. Julia crossed her arms, clearly conflicted. And what if he does find out? What then? What's to stop him from doing what he did to my mother? I won't let that happen, David said, his voice firm and resolute. I couldn't save Elena, but I won't fail you. Not again. The words hung in the air between them. Julia's eyes softened slightly, but the fear was still there. She had been thrust into a world of danger she never knew existed, and it was overwhelming. After a long pause, Julia finally nodded. Okay, she said quietly. I'll let you handle it, but I need time. All of this, it's a lot to take in. David nodded, understanding. I know. Take all the time you need. The next few days passed in a blur. David had his security team in place, keeping a close eye on Julia without intruding on her daily life. He remained in contact with Blake, trying to gather more information about Delacroix's activities and how close he might be to discovering Julia's existence. Every day that passed, the tension inside David grew. He couldn't stop thinking about Julia's safety, about what Delacroix might do if he found out she was his daughter. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. Julia was his, and he had to protect her at all costs. It was on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when things took a darker turn. David was in his office, going over documents for a new business venture when his phone rang. It was Blake. David, Blake said, his tone urgent. I've got news. Bad news. David's heart dropped. What is it? I've been tracking Delacroix's recent movements, Blake explained. He's made contact with a few of his old associates. It looks like he's sniffing around, trying to find out more about Julia. David's blood ran cold. Does he know? Not yet, Blake answered, but he's getting close. Too close. He's already spoken to a few people who might know something about Elena's past. It's only a matter of time before he connects the dots. David stood up from his desk, his pulse pounding in his ears. We need to stop him. Now. I'm working on it, Blake said. But Delacroix is slippery. He's keeping a low profile, using proxies to do his dirty work. If you want to stop him, You're going to have to be ready for a fight. David's jaw tightened. He had expected this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. He couldn't let Victor Delacroix get his hands on Julia, not after everything that had already been lost. I'll do whatever it takes, David said coldly. Just tell me what we need to do. Blake hesitated before speaking again. There's one more thing, David. Delacroix might not just be after Julia. He could be planning something bigger. I've heard rumors that he's preparing to strike against your company, an inside move. David's eyes darkened. So, he's coming after me from both sides. Exactly, Blake confirmed. He's trying to weaken you in every way he can. He'll hit you where it hurts most. David's mind was already racing. He had prepared for corporate warfare before, but this was different. This wasn't just about business or money. This was about Julia, about protecting her from a man who had no limits. Whatever he's planning, it ends now, David said firmly. I'm not going to wait for him to strike. I'll keep digging, Blake promised. But be careful. Delacroix isn't going to play fair. David hung up the phone, his heart racing. The battle was coming. And this time, it wasn't just about his empire. It was about family. He had already lost Elena. He wasn't about to lose Julia. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, a grim determination settling over him. The fight with Delacroix was about to get ugly, but David was ready. No matter what it took, he would protect his daughter. David Parker's heart pounded as he drove through the darkening streets, his mind filled with the chaos of what was about to unfold. He knew Victor Delacroix too well. Delacroix wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator. He didn't care about laws or ethics, only power and control. And now, after years of lying in the shadows, he was coming for the one thing that mattered more to David than anything, Julia. As David pulled up in front of Julia's house, his body tensed. He scanned the street for any sign of danger, his instincts on high alert. His private security had been in place for days now, but that didn't ease the knot of fear tightening in his chest. Delacroix had a way of striking when you least expected it, and David wasn't about to let him catch them off guard. He knocked on Julia's door, and after a moment, she opened it. She looked tired, as if the weight of everything he had told her was slowly crushing her spirit. But there was also a determination in her eyes, a strength she had inherited from her mother. "David," she greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." "I had to come," David said, his voice serious as he stepped inside. "We need to talk. There's something important you need to know." Julia's brow furrowed as she closed the door behind him. She motioned for him to sit on the small couch, and as she sat across from him, her expression was one of confusion and concern. "What is it? What's happened?" she asked, her tone cautious. David took a deep breath. He had to be careful about how much he revealed, but he couldn't afford to leave her in the dark. "I've had my investigator tracking Delacroix's movements. He's getting closer, Julia. He's digging into your mother's past, and he's likely going to find out who you are soon. We don't have much time." Julia's face paled. "You mean he'll know I'm your daughter?" David nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, and once he does, he'll come for you." Julia shook her head, fear flickering in her eyes. "But why? I don't have anything to do with this. I don't know him. Why would he come after me?" "It's not about you personally," David explained, his voice tight with urgency. "It's about me. Delacroix has always hated me. He'll use anything he can to get to me, and you're a piece of that puzzle now. He wanted to use your mother against me, and now he'll do the same with you." Julia stood up and began pacing the small room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This is insane. I can't believe this is happening. All my life, I thought my mother just died. I thought I was alone. And now I find out there's this whole world of danger I never knew existed." David's heart ached as he watched her struggle with the weight of it all. He stood up and gently took her by the shoulders, forcing her to stop pacing and meet his eyes. "Listen to me, Julia. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I failed your mother, but I won't fail you. I swear it." Julia searched his face, her expression softening slightly as she absorbed his words. "How can you be so sure? This man, he sounds unstoppable." "He's not unstoppable," David said firmly. "He's dangerous, yes, but he's not invincible. We're going to make sure he never gets the chance to hurt you. Julia nodded slowly, though the fear was still there. She had spent years building a quiet life, free from the complications of wealth and power, and now that life was crumbling around her. She had never asked for any of this, but she was caught in the crossfire nonetheless. What do we do now? Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David released her shoulders and began pacing, his mind already working through the possibilities. I've already arranged for security to keep an eye on you, but that won't be enough. Delacroix isn't the kind of man who strikes openly. He'll wait until the moment is right, until we're vulnerable. Julia bit her lip, her eyes following his every movement. So how do we stop him? David paused, staring out the window into the quiet street. We go on the offensive. We force his hand. He's been moving in the shadows for too long, controlling everything from behind the scenes. It's time to drag him into the light. Julia frowned, confusion creasing her forehead. How do we do that? David turned to face her, his expression sharp with determination. By confronting him directly. I'm going to meet him face to face, and I'm going to make sure he knows that if he comes after you, he's going to regret it. Julia's eyes widened. You're going to meet him? Are you insane? What if he tries to hurt you? David shook his head. I've dealt with men like Delacroix before. He won't hurt me, not until he thinks he can win. But I'm not going there alone. I'm going to make sure I have the upper hand. Julia stood frozen for a moment, absorbing his words. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped forward and touched his arm gently. David, you don't have to do this for me. I can handle myself. You've already done so much. David looked down at her, his heart swelling with emotion. In so many ways, she reminded him of Elena, strong, resilient, and unwilling to back down. But he couldn't let her face this on her own. He had already lost too much. I'm doing this because I failed to protect your mother, David said quietly. I won't make that mistake again. 2 days later, David was sitting in a dimly lit, high-end restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, waiting for Victor Delacroix. It had taken some maneuvering to set up the meeting, but David knew that Delacroix wouldn't be able to resist the invitation. The game between them had always been one of power and control, and David was making the first move. The restaurant was discreet, known for its privacy and its ability to host meetings between powerful men who didn't want their affairs to be public. The soft hum of conversation around him provided a calm backdrop to the tension that was building inside David. He knew this confrontation was risky, but it was a risk he was willing to take. Delacroix arrived precisely on time, just as David knew he would. The man had aged since they last saw each other, his hair graying at the edges, his sharp features lined with years of scheming and ruthlessness. But the predatory gleam in his eyes hadn't faded. He was still the same dangerous man David had always known. David, Delacroix greeted him smoothly, sliding into the chair across from him. I must say, I was surprised to hear from you. After all these years, I thought you'd be content hiding behind your empire. David didn't flinch. This isn't about the past, Victor. This is about my family. Delacroix raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Your family? I wasn't aware you had one. David's eyes narrowed. Don't play games with me. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Julia, Elena's daughter. Delacroix's smile widened, and for a moment, David saw the man behind the mask. Cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Ah, yes. Julia, Delacroix mused, leaning back in his chair. I've heard whispers about her. Quite the surprise, isn't it? To think, all these years, and Elena's legacy lives on. What a shame she didn't live long enough to see it herself. David's fists clenched under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. Delacroix was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction, but David wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I'm here to make sure you stay away from her, David said coldly. If you so much as look in her direction, I'll make sure you regret it. Delacroix chuckled softly, as if amused by David's threat. And what makes you think I'm interested in her? She's nothing more than a pawn, David. Just like Elena was. Useful, but ultimately expendable. David's blood boiled, but he kept his voice steady. She's my daughter, and if you come after her, I'll destroy you. Delacroix leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. Destroy me? You've tried that before, David, and look where we are now. I'm still here, stronger than ever. Do you really think you can protect her from me? David's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. I'll protect her, and I'll make sure you never get close enough to try. For a long moment, Delacroix studied him, his smile fading into something darker, more dangerous. Then, slowly, he stood up, adjusting his jacket as he prepared to leave. You've always been a fool, David, Delacroix said, his voice soft but menacing. You think you can save everyone, but you can't. Julia will be mine when the time comes, just like Elena should have been, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. David stood as well, his eyes locked on Delacroix. You're wrong. This time, you lose. Delacroix smirked, his eyes glittering with malice. We'll see. With that, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving David standing there, his heart pounding with both fury and fear. The battle lines had been drawn. The fight was coming, and David would do whatever it took to protect Julia from the man who had already stolen so much from him. The following morning, David woke with a sense of urgency thrumming through his veins. The confrontation with Delacroix had rattled him more than he'd let on. His words, "Julia will be mine when the time comes," echoed in his mind like a dark prophecy. He knew Delacroix too well. The man was setting his pieces in place, preparing to strike when David least expected it. David wasn't going to wait for that moment. After a restless night, he called his security team and doubled the protection around Julia's house. He arranged for her movements to be monitored closely, though discreetly, ensuring she was never alone, even if she didn't realize it. This wasn't just about protecting Julia anymore. It was about staying one step ahead of Delacroix, cutting him off before he could act. But Delacroix wasn't a man who played fair. That afternoon, Julia received a call. Sitting in her small living room, she stared at the unknown number flashing on her phone screen. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the answer button, her heart heavy with the weight of everything David had told her. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Julia Weston?" A smooth, unfamiliar voice asked on the other end. Julia's pulse quickened. "Who's calling?" There was a brief pause before the man spoke again, his tone polite but chilling. "I represent Mr. Victor Delacroix. He's requested a meeting with you." Julia felt her stomach twist. Delacroix. The name sent a wave of dread washing over her. David had warned her about him, about the danger he posed. But now he was reaching out to her directly. "I'm not interested," Julia said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound firm. "I'm afraid this isn't a request, Miss Weston." The man continued, his voice calm, almost condescending. "Mr. Delacroix would like to explain a few things to you, about your mother, about your past. He believes it's in your best interest to listen." Julia swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. This man was threatening her, no matter how politely he phrased it. But what did Delacroix know about her mother that David hadn't already told her? And why was he so desperate to meet with her? "I don't care what he has to say," she replied, her anger rising to the surface. "Tell him to leave me alone." The man chuckled softly, as though he found her resistance amusing. "Miss Weston, you might want to reconsider. Mr. Delacroix isn't a man to ignore. He always gets what he wants in the end. And right now, he wants to speak with you." Julia felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. She didn't know what to do. David had warned her to stay away from Delacroix, but now it felt like there was no escaping him. "Goodbye," Julia said sharply, hanging up before the man could say another word. Her hand shook as she set the phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. She immediately dialed David, hoping he would pick up quickly. David was in his office when Julia's call came in, his mind deep in strategy about how to corner Delacroix legally and financially. His phone buzzed, and seeing Julia's name, he answered it instantly. "Julia, are you okay?" David asked, his tone full of concern. Julia's voice trembled. "David, I just got a call. Someone from Delacroix's side. He wants to meet me." David's grip on the phone tightened. His worst fear was unfolding faster than he had anticipated. Delacroix wasn't wasting any time. He was moving in on Julia, and the clock was ticking. "What did they say?" David asked, His voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath. They said he knows things about my mother, about my past, Julia explained, her voice shaky. They made it sound like I have no choice but to meet him. You're not meeting him, David said firmly. Don't listen to anything he says. He's trying to manipulate you, just like he did with your mother. It's a trap? Julia's silence on the other end of the line only deepened David's sense of dread. She was scared, and she had every reason to be. Delacroix was a master at preying on fear, twisting emotions until his victims felt cornered. David had seen it happen before, and he wasn't about to let it happen to Julia. Julia, listen to me, David continued, his voice softening. I know this is overwhelming, but you have to trust me. Delacroix will use anything he can to control you. You can't meet with him. Promise me you won't. After a long pause, Julia finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I won't. But, David, what if he knows something? What if there's more to my mother's past than you know? David's heart ached at the uncertainty in her voice. He wanted to tell her that he knew everything, that there were no more secrets to uncover. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Elena had left him in the dark about so much, and if Delacroix had been following her all those years, there could be things even David hadn't uncovered. I'll find out what he knows, David promised. But you can't trust him. He'll use any lie to get close to you. Okay, Julia agreed, though the hesitation was still there. But what do we do now? David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I'm going to take this fight to him. He's been in the shadows for too long. It's time we turn the tables. Later that evening, David met with Thomas Blake in a quiet office away from prying eyes. Blake had been gathering more information on Delacroix, and David knew it was time to go on the offensive. I've dug deeper, Blake said, flipping through a thick file as David sat across from him. Delacroix has been involved in several shady deals over the last few years, but none of it's traceable to him directly. He's been using intermediaries, shell companies, typical moves for a man trying to stay untouchable. David clenched his jaw. There has to be something we can use. He's not untouchable. Blake nodded, a sly grin crossing his face. I've found a weak link. One of his key associates, Nicholas Hale, has been sloppy. If we can pressure him, we might get what we need to bring Delacroix down. David's eyes narrowed. Hale? I've heard of him. Delacroix has used him for years. Exactly, Blake said. But Hale's been hiding some dirty money deals, and he's not as clever as Delacroix. He's vulnerable. If we apply the right pressure, we can get him to talk. David felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They could use Hale to force Delacroix's hand, to bring him out of the shadows and expose the criminal operations he'd been running. Make it happen, David said firmly. I want Delacroix's network dismantled piece by piece, and I want it done quickly. He's already reaching out to Julia, and I'm not giving him a chance to get any closer. Blake nodded. I'll start working on Hale. It won't be long before Delacroix feels the pressure. That night, as David sat alone in his penthouse apartment, the city lights twinkling below him, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every hour brought Delacroix closer to Julia, closer to uncovering her identity and using her as a pawn in his twisted game. David wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Julia. She had already lost her mother to this world of lies and danger, and David would be damned if he let her lose anything more. He was going to stop Delacroix, no matter the cost, even if it meant tearing down the empire he had built, brick by brick. The following morning, Blake made his move on Nicholas Hale. It didn't take long to corner him. Hale had been involved in a series of fraudulent financial dealings that left him vulnerable to blackmail. When Blake approached him, it was clear that Hale was nervous, sweating under the pressure of the evidence Blake had gathered. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Hale, Blake said, leaning over the table in the small, dimly lit room where they had met. You tell me everything you know about Delacroix's current plans, or I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life behind bars. Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He knew he was cornered, and after a long, agonizing silence, he cracked. All right, Hale muttered, his voice shaky. I'll tell you what I know. Blake leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with victory. Start talking. As David sat in his office later that day, Blake called him with the news. Hale talked, Blake said. Delacroix is planning something big. It's not just about you. It's about your company. He's been working behind the scenes, buying up shares through intermediaries. He's planning a hostile takeover. David's blood ran cold. A hostile takeover? Delacroix was coming for everything. His company, his fortune, and his family. But David wasn't going to let him win. This ends now, David said, his voice hard as steel. We're going to take him down, Blake. No matter what it takes. Blake paused before responding. Be careful, David. Delacroix isn't going to go down without a fight. He's already made his move. The question is, how far is he willing to go? David clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. As far as he wants. I'm ready. David Parker stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. His reflection in the glass felt distant, as if he were watching a stranger, someone detached from the life he had once carefully built. The news that Blake had delivered was like a wrecking ball crashing through his world. Delacroix wasn't just coming after Julia. He was coming for everything. David had spent years preparing for the possibility of corporate attacks, even from men like Victor Delacroix. But this? A hostile takeover, the manipulation of his company's shares from the shadows. This was more than a business move. It was personal, a final strike meant to destroy everything he held dear. And worst of all, Julia's life was caught in the crossfire. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. Blake had gathered enough information from Nicholas Hale to confirm that Delacroix was planning to make his move soon. The plan was simple but devastating. Delacroix was using shell companies and proxies to buy up controlling shares of Parker Industries. He had spent months orchestrating the takeover, and now, the final pieces were falling into place. But David wasn't going to sit back and wait to be ruined. It was time to set a trap of his own. Later that day, David gathered his most trusted executives in a private meeting at the Parker Industries headquarters. The air in the room was thick with tension as David laid out the situation. His senior staff, men and women who had helped him build his empire, listened in stunned silence as he explained the impending takeover attempt. Delacroix has been playing the long game, David said, pacing in front of the table. He's been buying up shares quietly, using intermediaries to stay hidden. But thanks to Blake, we know exactly how he's doing it. David paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, his voice hardening with resolve. We have to act now. If we don't, he'll gain control of the company before we even realize it. His CFO, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel Scott, was the first to speak up. What's our counter-strategy? Can we stop him from reaching the majority he needs? David nodded. We're going to hit him where it hurts. He's relying on these shell companies to keep his identity hidden, but we've already exposed one of his key players, Nicholas Hale. Blake is working to dismantle his network, but that's not enough. David leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. We need to drive up the share prices. Make it too expensive for Delacroix to buy any more stock without bleeding himself dry. If we can manipulate the market in our favor, we'll slow him down long enough to take legal action. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. It's risky, but it could work. We need to put out positive projections, show our investors that Parker Industries is on the verge of a major upswing. That'll attract other buyers and raise the price of the remaining shares. David's COO, Michael Greer, chimed in. We'll have to be careful. If Delacroix catches wind of what we're doing, he might try to force the takeover earlier. David locked eyes with Michael, his voice low but determined. Let him. The moment he tries to make his move, we'll be ready. Meanwhile, Julia was trying to make sense of the chaos her life had become. Since David's revelations about her mother and the looming danger of Delacroix, she had barely slept. The past few days felt like a blur, an endless spiral of fear, uncertainty, and disbelief. She hadn't expected to learn that her entire life had been shaped by forces beyond her control. Her mother's disappearance, the secrets about her past, the threat posed by a man she had never even met. It was all too much. And now, the pressure of knowing that Delacroix might come after her was suffocating. Despite her fear, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do more than just hide behind the security David had arranged for her. She wasn't the kind of person to sit idly by while others fought her battles. But what could she do against someone like Delacroix? She sat in her small living room, staring at the phone in her hand. The number of the mysterious caller, the man who worked for Delacroix, was still saved in her call log. The thought of reaching out terrified her, but a part of her felt like she needed to confront the danger head-on. She needed answers. She needed to understand why Delacroix was so fixated on her and her mother. Julia's fingers hovered over the screen, her heart pounding. She knew it was reckless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Delacroix knew something she didn't, something David wasn't telling her. Finally, with a deep breath, she dialed the number. It rang twice before the same cold, smooth voice from before answered. "Miss Weston," the man said, his tone laced with amusement. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you again." Julia swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "I want to know the truth about my mother, about why Delacroix is so interested in me." There was a pause on the other end, and when the man spoke again, there was a dangerous edge to his voice. "Mr. Delacroix would be happy to tell you everything, but it's not safe to talk over the phone. Meet with him, and you'll get the answers you're looking for." Julia hesitated. Every instinct told her to hang up, to listen to David's warnings. But the urge to uncover the truth, to finally understand what had happened to her mother, was too strong. "I'll meet him," Julia said quietly, her heart racing with fear and adrenaline. "But only on my terms." The man chuckled softly. "Of course. I'll arrange everything." That evening, David received an urgent call from Blake. "David, we've got a problem," Blake said, his voice tense. "One of my contacts just informed me that Julia reached out to Delacroix's people. She's agreed to meet him." David's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" "I told her not to." "I don't think she trusts Delacroix," Blake replied quickly. "But she's desperate for answers about her mother. And you know Delacroix, he's a master at manipulating people's emotions." David's mind raced. He couldn't believe Julia would take such a risk, especially after everything he had told her. But at the same time, he understood her need for closure. Elena's disappearance had left a hole in both of their lives, and Delacroix was the one man who might have the answers. "We have to stop her," David said, his voice hard. "I'm not letting her walk into a trap." "I'm already tracking Delacroix's movements," Blake assured him. "But I need more time to find out where the meeting is taking place. Once I know, we can intervene." David's heart pounded. Time was running out, and every second that passed brought Julia closer to danger. Delacroix was playing his game perfectly, pulling the strings behind the scenes, setting traps that were invisible until they snapped shut. But this time, David wasn't going to let him win. The next day, Julia stood nervously at the edge of a quiet park. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty benches and pathways. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she waited, scanning the area for any sign of Delacroix or his men. She knew it was reckless to come here alone, but she had insisted. She didn't want David or anyone else involved. She needed to face Delacroix herself, to look him in the eye and demand the truth. Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up at the far end of the park. Julia's heart raced as a tall, thin man stepped out of the passenger side. He wore a sharp suit, his dark hair slicked back, and his eyes glinted with cold amusement as he approached her. "Miss Weston," the man said smoothly, offering a polite nod. "Mr. Delacroix is waiting for you." Julia's stomach churned with dread, but she forced herself to stand tall. She couldn't back out now. She had to see this through. The man gestured for her to follow him, and Julia hesitated for only a moment before falling in step behind him. As they approached the car, the door opened, and there he was, Victor Delacroix. He was older than she had expected, with silver hair and piercing eyes that held a predatory gleam. But there was an air of control about him, a quiet confidence that sent a chill down her spine. He smiled at her, though there was no warmth in it. "Miss Weston," Delacroix said, his voice as smooth as silk. "I'm so glad you decided to meet with me. Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Julia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she looked into Delacroix's eyes, she realized something. She wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. This man, for all his power and control, was just a man. And if he thought he could manipulate her, he was wrong. "I'll stand," Julia said firmly. Just tell me what you know about my mother. Delacroix's smile widened, and he gestured to the seat beside him, as if inviting her to join a conversation over tea. Oh, Julia, he said softly, there's so much you don't know. So much that David hasn't told you. Julia's heart skipped a beat at the mention of David's name, but she didn't flinch. I'm not interested in your games, Julia replied, her voice steady. Tell me what happened to my mother. Delacroix's eyes gleamed with something dark, something twisted. Your mother, he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, was a brilliant woman, but she was also a fool. She thought she could run from me, thought she could hide you from me, but I always knew where she was. Julia's blood ran cold. What are you saying? Delacroix leaned forward slightly, his smile fading into something more sinister. I'm saying that your mother's death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't from illness. I made sure of that. Julia's breath caught in her throat as Delacroix's words sank in. Her mother? Murdered? By him? You killed her, Julia whispered, her voice trembling with shock and rage. Delacroix's smile returned, cold and predatory. I had no choice. She was a loose end. And now, Julia, so are you. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, each beat deafening in the silence that followed Delacroix's chilling confession. His words echoed in her mind, leaving her paralyzed with fear and rage. Your mother's death wasn't an accident. She had come here looking for answers, for closure, but the truth was far more horrifying than she had imagined. The man sitting before her, calm, composed, and completely devoid of remorse, had murdered her mother. And now, as his cold gaze settled on her, Julia realized she had walked straight into his trap. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Delacroix's smile widened, as if savoring her fear. You're lying, Julia whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Delacroix leaned back in his seat, crossing his legs casually. I assure you, I'm not. Elena made her choices, just as you are making yours now. She defied me, and she paid the price. And now, Julia, you stand in the same position. Julia's breath hitched, her mind racing to find a way out of this nightmare. What had she done? David had warned her not to meet with Delacroix, but she had been too desperate for answers, too consumed by the need to understand her past. And now, she was trapped. Delacroix continued, his voice soft but menacing. You see, I've spent years waiting for this moment, waiting for you to resurface. Elena thought she could hide you from me, but the truth always finds its way to the light, doesn't it? Julia swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. What do you want from me? Delacroix tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. What I want, Julia, is very simple. Your cooperation. If you agree to work with me, to stand by my side, I'll ensure your safety. You'll have a place in the world of power and control, the likes of which David Parker can never offer you. Julia recoiled at the offer. You think I would ever join you after what you did to my mother? Delacroix's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You may not have a choice, Julia. The world is dangerous, and without the right protection, you won't last long. Especially not with David Parker as your so-called guardian. He's already failed once. Do you really think he can protect you now? The venom in Delacroix's words sent a chill down Julia's spine. For a moment, doubt flickered in her mind. Could David really protect her? Delacroix had already proven he was willing to do anything to destroy the people who stood in his way. But Julia quickly pushed the doubt aside. She knew David would never abandon her. He had already risked everything to keep her safe. I'll never work with you, Julia said firmly, her voice filled with defiance. And I'll never forgive you for what you did to my mother. Delacroix's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. Such a shame. You're just as stubborn as she was. Julia felt a surge of fear as Delacroix's tone darkened. She needed to get out of there now, but as she glanced around the park, she realized there were no easy escapes. Delacroix's men had positioned themselves strategically, blocking any path she might take. She was outnumbered, trapped. Before she could respond, Delacroix spoke again, his voice laced with cold menace. I had hoped you would see reason, Julia, but since you've chosen David over me, You forced my hand. He stood up from the car, his eyes locked on her. I can't let you leave here. Panic surged through Julia's body. She took a step back, her mind racing. Her breath came in shallow gasps as Delacroix's men began to close in around her. She needed to escape, but how? Her phone was in her pocket. If she could just get a message to David. Suddenly, one of Delacroix's men reached out to grab her, but Julia acted on instinct. She spun around, her body fueled by adrenaline, and bolted toward the only open path she could see, a narrow alleyway leading out of the park. She didn't look back. The sound of footsteps pounding behind her told her all she needed to know. They were coming for her. David Parker was already on his way to the park. The moment Blake had called to tell him that Julia had agreed to meet Delacroix, David's world had shifted into overdrive. He couldn't believe she had taken the risk, especially after everything he had warned her about. But he understood. Julia had been searching for answers, desperate to know the truth about her mother, and Delacroix had played her perfectly. Now, David's only concern was getting to her in time. He pressed down on the gas pedal, weaving through the evening traffic as fast as he could. The park where the meeting was taking place wasn't far, but every minute that passed felt like an eternity. He had seen firsthand what Delacroix was capable of, his cruelty, his manipulations, and David wasn't about to let Julia fall into his hands. His phone buzzed, and he quickly glanced at the screen. It was Blake. Blake, where is she? David demanded, his voice tight with urgency. Delacroix has her cornered, Blake replied, his tone grim. My team's tracking them, but she's on the run. He's got men all over the park. David's heart raced. I'm almost there. Hurry, David. She doesn't have much time. David hung up, his mind filled with a single thought. I can't lose her. Not like I lost Elena. Julia's lungs burned as she sprinted through the narrow alley, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She could hear the shouts of Delacroix's men, their voices echoing in the darkness. She turned a sharp corner, her feet skidding on the slick pavement, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her mind was focused on one thing: survival. She had to find a way out, had to escape before they caught up to her. As she ran, she reached into her pocket and fumbled for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she quickly sent a single text message to David. Help. She didn't know if he would receive it in time, but it was her only hope. Just as she rounded another corner, she collided with something solid. She let out a small cry of surprise as she stumbled backward, but before she could react, a pair of strong arms caught her. For a split second, terror gripped her. Had they caught her? But then she heard a familiar voice, filled with relief. Julia, it's me. Julia looked up, her heart racing, and saw David standing in front of her, his face etched with concern. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by fear as the sound of approaching footsteps filled the alley. They're coming, Julia gasped, her chest heaving from the run. We have to go. David's grip on her arm tightened as he pulled her toward a nearby exit. Stay close. I've got you. They ran together, David leading her through a maze of alleyways and side streets, always staying one step ahead of Delacroix's men. Julia's mind raced as she tried to process everything that had happened. Delacroix's confession, the chase, and now the relief of seeing David again. It was all too much. But there was no time to think, no time to feel. They had to keep moving. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a quiet side street, hidden away from prying eyes. David slowed their pace, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Are you okay? He asked, turning to Julia. Julia nodded, though her body still trembled with fear. He killed her, David, she whispered, her voice shaking. Delacroix killed my mother. David's expression darkened, his jaw clenched with anger. I know, he said softly. I'll make him pay for what he's done. I promise. Julia looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. I should have listened to you. I thought I could handle it, but he's too dangerous. I was stupid. You weren't stupid, David said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. You were trying to find the truth. But now, you need to trust me. I won't let him get near you again. Julia nodded, her emotions too raw for words. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. But in David's presence, she also felt safe, as if he was the only person in the world who could protect her from the darkness closing in around them. "We need to move," David said, glancing around cautiously. "Delacroix's men are still out there, and we can't stay here." "Where do we go?" Julia asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. David's eyes hardened with determination. "We're going to end this." The final showdown was inevitable. David knew that Delacroix wouldn't back down easily, but he wasn't going to let Julia live in fear any longer. The time for running and hiding was over. David had built an empire, fought off enemies in the business world. But this was personal. He wasn't just fighting for his company. He was fighting for the woman who had captured his heart and the daughter he hadn't known existed until it was almost too late. It was time to bring the fight to Delacroix. David stood at the edge of the Parker Industries boardroom, the morning light casting long shadows across the sleek, modern space. His mind was sharp, but beneath the calm exterior, a storm of emotions churned. He had spent the last few hours planning, analyzing every angle of the coming battle. This wasn't just about protecting Julia. It was about ending Victor Delacroix once and for all. Blake had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, dismantling Delacroix's network of shell companies and proxy investors. The market was reacting exactly as David had hoped. Share prices were rising, and Delacroix's plan for a hostile takeover was crumbling. But David knew this victory wouldn't be won through the stock market alone. It was time for something more direct. The clock was ticking, and David needed to draw Delacroix out into the open. That was the only way to end this once and for all. He couldn't keep waiting for the perfect moment. He had to force Delacroix's hand, and today, he would do exactly that. As he stared out the window, his phone buzzed. It was Blake. "David." Blake's voice was steady but urgent. "I've tracked Delacroix. He's at his private estate just outside the city. Looks like he's holed up there, but he knows you're moving in on his companies. He's getting desperate." David's heart pounded with anticipation. Desperation made men dangerous, but it also made them reckless. Delacroix's empire was crumbling, and he had lost control of the game he had been playing for years. Now, David would give him a choice: surrender or face the consequences. "I'm going to him," David said, his voice firm. Blake hesitated. "David, you know he won't just back down. This man killed Elena and went after Julia. He's not going to go down without a fight." "I'm counting on that," David replied. "I need to end this." Blake sighed, but there was a note of agreement in his voice. "I'll have backup ready if you need it." "Thanks, Blake. I'll handle it from here." David ended the call and pocketed his phone, his mind clear. He knew what he had to do. An hour later, David stood in front of Delacroix's sprawling estate. The gates loomed high above him, sleek and imposing, but they didn't intimidate him. He had faced bigger threats, darker enemies. This was just another battle. But this time, the stakes were personal. Julia had insisted on coming with him, despite his protests. She was done hiding, done being afraid, and she wanted to see this through to the end. As they approached the gate, her face was pale but determined, her chin held high. "You don't have to be here," David said quietly, glancing at her. "This could get ugly." Julia shook her head, her voice steady. "I need to be here. I need to face him." David nodded, respecting her choice. She had more strength than she realized, and today she would need every ounce of it. He pressed the intercom at the gate, and after a moment, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Mr. Parker." The voice was cold and familiar. It was Delacroix's right-hand man. "Mr. Delacroix has been expecting you." The gate slowly creaked open, and David led Julia through. The estate was eerily quiet, its manicured lawns and towering trees casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. As they walked up the stone pathway, the grand mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. Julia's hand trembled slightly at her side, but she kept her head high. David could feel her fear, but he knew she wasn't going to back down. They reached the front door, and before they could knock, it swung open. Victor Delacroix stood in the doorway, his sharp features twisted into a cold smile. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed, but there was an unmistakable edge of desperation in his eyes. David, Delacroix greeted him smoothly, though his voice held a dangerous undertone. And Julia, how lovely to see you both. Julia stiffened beside David, but she didn't flinch. David stepped forward, his eyes locked on Delacroix. This ends today, Victor. Delacroix's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. I doubt that. You see, David, you've been playing a very dangerous game. But you don't realize that I still hold all the cards. David's jaw tightened, his voice low and calm. You're losing, Victor. Your takeover failed. Your companies are collapsing. You have nothing left but empty threats. Delacroix's expression darkened, and for the first time, David saw the cracks in his facade. The man was unraveling. His control was slipping, and beneath his calm exterior, fury boiled. I made a mistake with Elena, Delacroix said softly, stepping closer. I underestimated her. I won't make the same mistake with you, or with Julia. Julia's breath caught in her throat as Delacroix's cold gaze shifted to her. You look so much like her, he mused, his voice almost wistful. It's a shame you're on the wrong side of this fight. But you don't have to be. You could still join me. David stepped in front of Julia, his voice hard. She's not joining you, Delacroix, and you're going to leave her alone, or I'll make sure you never hurt anyone again. Delacroix's smile disappeared, replaced by a sneer of anger. You think you can threaten me? I could destroy you both with a single phone call. You forget, David, that I've spent years building this empire. You can tear down a few walls, but I'm still standing. And as long as I'm standing, Julia will never be safe. David clenched his fists, every muscle in his body tensing with rage. This man had killed Elena, shattered her life, and now he was threatening Julia. It took every ounce of restraint not to lash out, but David knew that the real victory wouldn't come through violence. It would come through exposing Delacroix for the monster he truly was. You've already lost, David said quietly, his eyes locked on Delacroix. You just don't know it yet. Delacroix's eyes flickered with uncertainty for the briefest moment, but then his sneer returned. We'll see about that. Suddenly, from behind them, the sound of footsteps approached rapidly. David and Julia turned just as Blake appeared, flanked by two of David's security men. Blake's face was grim, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. We've got him, Blake said, his voice firm. We've traced everything back to Delacroix, every illegal deal, every fraudulent transaction. It's over, Victor. The authorities are already on their way. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Delacroix's face drained of color, his cold composure shattering in an instant. He turned to Blake, his eyes wide with shock. What? Blake stepped forward, his voice cold and decisive. We've been working behind the scenes for weeks, pulling apart your empire piece by piece. The SEC is coming for you, Victor. You'll be lucky if you see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of your life. Delacroix's hands trembled as he tried to regain his composure, but it was too late. The trap had been set, and he had walked straight into it. You think you can take everything from me? Delacroix spat, his voice filled with venom. I've built this empire. I've built everything. And now it's falling apart, David said quietly, his gaze never leaving Delacroix. Just like you. Delacroix's fury erupted. In a sudden, desperate move, he lunged toward Julia, his hand reaching for her. But David was faster. He stepped in front of Julia, his arm blocking Delacroix's path, and in one swift motion, he shoved Delacroix backward. Delacroix stumbled, his face twisted with rage. But before he could react, Blake's security team moved in. They grabbed Delacroix by the arms, pulling him away from Julia and restraining him. You'll regret this, Parker, Delacroix shouted, his voice wild with desperation. I'll destroy you. I'll destroy everything you love. David stood tall, his voice calm and resolute. It's over, Victor. Delacroix struggled against the security team, but it was no use. He was done. As the authorities arrived and took Delacroix into custody, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. The man who had haunted his life, who had destroyed Elena and threatened Julia, was finished. Justice had been served. David turned to Julia, his expression softening. Are you okay? Julia nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for everything." David reached out, gently taking her hand. "I told you I'd protect you, and I always will." For a long moment, they stood together in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, the weight of the past lifting from their shoulders. The danger had passed, and though the scars would remain, they knew they had survived the worst of it together. As they walked away from the estate, hand in hand, Julia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The truth about her mother had finally been uncovered, and the man who had destroyed her family was no longer a threat. But most importantly, she had found something she never expected: a father, a protector, and the beginnings of a new life. The days following Victor Delacroix's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions for both David and Julia. The media had caught wind of the story, with news outlets buzzing about the downfall of the once mighty business tycoon and the secrets that had led to his unraveling. But for David and Julia, the chaos outside felt like a distant noise compared to the storm that had raged within their lives. David had spent years building his empire, always moving forward, always focused on success. But now, standing at the end of this chapter of his life, he realized that none of it compared to the bond he had found with Julia. In her, he saw the future, the part of Elena that still lived on, the part he had never known he was missing. 3 weeks later, David and Julia stood side by side at Elena's gravesite, the wind whispering softly through the trees. It was a quiet, sunny afternoon, and the warmth of the sun felt like a gentle reminder that life could begin anew, even after the darkest storms. For years, David had come to this place alone, carrying the weight of guilt and sorrow over Elena's disappearance. He had never truly found peace, always haunted by the unknowns. But now, with Julia standing beside him, it felt different. The past had been unearthed, the truth revealed, and though the pain of loss still lingered, there was a sense of closure, a release from the heavy burden he had carried for so long. Julia knelt down, gently placing a bouquet of white roses on the gravestone. Her fingers lingered on the cool stone, tracing the carved letters of her mother's name, and for the first time in her life, she felt connected to the woman she had lost too soon. She hadn't just found answers. She had found her identity, her roots, and a father who had been a stranger only weeks before. "I wish I had known her," Julia whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I wish she had told me more." David knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "She was trying to protect you," he said gently. "She thought keeping you away from all of this would give you a better life. But I know, she loved you more than anything." Julia nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I know. I just wish we'd had more time." David's heart ached at her words. He knew the feeling all too well, but as he looked at Julia, he realized that they had been given something more precious than time: a chance to heal together. "You still have me," David said quietly, "and I still have you." Julia smiled through her tears and wrapped her arms around him. For a long moment, they held each other, letting the silence speak for all the things they couldn't say. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least a new version of it. Delacroix's empire had collapsed under the weight of his crimes, and with the evidence Blake had gathered, the authorities ensured that he would never be a threat again. His name became a cautionary tale in business circles, a symbol of greed and corruption, but to David and Julia, he was a ghost from the past they had finally laid to rest. Parker Industries weathered the storm, emerging stronger than ever. David had made sure of that. The hostile takeover Delacroix had planned was no longer a threat, and with Blake's help, David had fortified the company against future attacks. But as the business world moved on, David found his priorities shifting. For the first time in years, he was looking beyond the walls of his company and into the life he had built, or rather, the life he still had a chance to build. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, David and Julia sat on the balcony of his penthouse, the cool breeze carrying with it a sense of calm. They had shared so many intense moments recently, chasing the truth, facing danger, but tonight was different. Tonight, they were simply enjoying the quiet, enjoying each other's company. Julia sipped her tea, glancing out at the skyline, her thoughts far away. Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things had been different? If my mom hadn't run, or if she had told you about me? David leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening as he considered her question. I think about it all the time, he admitted. But we can't live in the past. What matters is that we found each other now. It may not have happened the way we expected, but I think maybe this is how it was meant to be. Julia smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. Yeah, I guess you're right. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the lights of the city twinkled below them. Julia had started to adjust to this new life, a life where she wasn't just a stranger to the world of wealth and power, but someone with a rightful place in it. She had David, and though they still had so much to learn about each other, they had all the time in the world now. After a while, David spoke again, his voice thoughtful. There's something I've been thinking about. Julia turned to him, raising an eyebrow. What's that? David hesitated for a moment, then smiled softly. I want to take a break from the business. Spend more time focusing on what matters. On us. Julia blinked in surprise, but then her face broke into a wide grin. You? Taking a break from Parker Industries? I thought I'd never see the day. David chuckled. I've spent my entire life building that company. But you're the first person who's made me realize that there's more to life than just work. Julia's heart swelled with warmth. For so long, she had felt alone, disconnected from the people who mattered most. But now, with David in her life, she felt like she had found her place, her family. And what do you plan to do with all this free time? Julia teased, leaning back in her chair. David smiled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. I don't know. I was thinking maybe we could travel. There's a whole world out there that I've been too busy to see. We could go anywhere you want. Julia laughed. Anywhere? That sounds like a pretty tempting offer. David nodded, his expression sincere. You've spent your whole life searching for answers, Julia. Now, it's time to live. Julia looked at him, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt like her life wasn't defined by the past, by the secrets and the pain. She had a future now, one filled with possibility, with family, with love. And as they sat together, watching the stars begin to the night sky, Julia knew that no matter where life took them, they would face it together. They had survived the storm. Now, they were free to chase the light. Several months later, David and Julia stood on the deck of a sailboat, the warm ocean breeze ruffling their hair as they sailed along the coast of Greece. The sun was bright, the water sparkling like diamonds, and the world felt open and full of promise. It had been Julia's idea to take a break and travel, and David had happily agreed. They had already visited several countries, exploring new places and creating memories that would last a lifetime. This wasn't the life either of them had expected, but it was the life they had built together. As the boat glided over the waves, Julia leaned on the railing, her face glowing with happiness. David stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. Thank you, Julia said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. David looked at her, his brow furrowing. For what? For everything, Julia replied, turning to him with a smile. For being here. For being my father. David's heart swelled with emotion, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You've given me a second chance at life, Julia. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The past was behind them, the future wide open, and they knew that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. A new chapter had begun.